When someone leaves your life, whether through a breakup, a betrayal, or even silence, it is rarely the entirety of the relationship that defines your memory of them. More often than not, it is the way they left that leaves the deepest impression. The tone, the words, the body language, or sometimes the absence of all three, and overshadow years of connection. Departure defines legacy because it crystallizes the final emotional imprint of the relationship. It's the moment when all the pretense is stripped away, and what remains is either closure or confusion, respect or resentment. What a person chooses in that final moment speaks volumes about who they are and how they truly regarded the relationship. It reveals character in its rawest form. You may have shared 1,000 laughs or supported one another through difficult times, but if the last interaction was cold, dismissive, or cruel, that memory may override everything else. This isn't because people are ungrateful or incapable of remembering the good. It's because humans are wired to pay closer attention to emotional pain. The brain gives more weight to emotional injuries as a form of self-protection. That final act, how someone exits your life, gets etched more deeply into memory than all the casual, happy moments. It becomes a reference point for how safe or unsafe relationships can feel in the future. That moment of departure carries weight far beyond the seconds it took. It tells a story. It tells the person left behind whether they mattered, whether their feelings were seen, whether the shared history was valued, or whether they were disposable all along. What makes this so impactful is that departure is always a choice. It might be a necessary one, but the way it's done is within someone's full control. And in that choice lies the entire legacy of the relationship. People remember if you left them kindly, or if you made them feel abandoned and dehumanized. They remember if you explained, or if you vanished. They remember whether you ended things with empathy or with emotional violence. And that memory becomes a blueprint they carry into future relationships. How much they trust, how deeply they love, how long they hesitate. The way you leave someone can haunt them or help them, and it says just as much about you as it does about the bond you once shared. If the departure is done with clarity, honesty, and care, it becomes a bittersweet but dignified ending. If it's done with selfishness or silence, it becomes a wound. The final chapter of any connection isn't just the end, it's the part most likely to be remembered. And whether we like it or not, it becomes the summary others write about us in their minds. So in every goodbye, in every door we close, we are also writing the epilogue to someone else's emotional story. And that, more than anything, is what shapes the legacy we leave behind. Pain has a peculiar way of engraving itself into the human heart far more deeply than joy ever does. While joy is light and fleeting, often experienced in the moment and then left to fade like a pleasant dream, pain tends to linger, to echo, and to take root. It becomes a reference point, something we return to consciously or unconsciously when navigating future experiences. This imbalance is not a flaw of human emotion, but a survival mechanism built into us. From an evolutionary perspective, remembering what hurt us was essential for avoiding danger, betrayal, or emotional harm again. But what serves as protection can also become a prison, especially in the context of relationships. A single painful moment, especially one that feels like abandonment or emotional neglect, can eclipse years of kindness, warmth, and shared joy. It's not because the good times weren't real or meaningful, but because pain demands resolution, and until it gets it, it remains. People rarely recount all the moments they laughed with someone after they've been hurt. Instead, they remember the moment they felt rejected, misunderstood, or dismissed. That sharp edge of emotional injury becomes the focal point. A person might try to hold onto the good memories, but the mind naturally replays the bad ones as a form of preparation, as if to say, "Don't let this happen again." It distorts the emotional weight of the relationship, making it feel defined not by the highs, but by the final blow or the deepest cut. This is why a single act of betrayal or coldness can undermine years of love. It creates a rupture in the emotional narrative. The story no longer makes sense, and the confusion compounds the pain. Even people who have tried to move on, who have forgiven or rationalized the other's actions, often find themselves returning mentally to that one moment that broke them. That's the moment they relive when they hear a certain song or see a familiar place. That's the memory that pulls them back into emotional paralysis. And the more they replay it, the more it embeds itself. The joyful memories, on the other hand, become faded like a photograph left out in the sun. They were once vibrant but are now almost intangible, as if they happened to someone else. This is why people often need years of reflection or therapy to come to terms with something that only took a few minutes to happen. Because the weight of pain is not measured in time, but in impact. And when someone we love causes that pain, whether intentionally or not, it rewrites the emotional map. The places where we once felt safe now feel foreign. The moments that once brought us joy now carry a shadow. The human heart is resilient, but it is also impressionable, and while it can heal, it does not easily forget the exact shape of the wound. Pain outweighs joy not because joy is weak, but because pain, when unacknowledged or unresolved, demands to be remembered. When two people form a bond, whether romantic, familial, or even platonic, there is an invisible agreement that takes shape, one that is rarely spoken but deeply felt. It is the understanding that both individuals are entering into a space where their actions, words, and silences carry weight. This is the moral responsibility that comes with connection. When we become significant in someone's life, we also become partially responsible for the impact we have on their emotional and psychological well-being. Our presence or lack thereof can shape the way someone sees themselves and the world around them. It's not a matter of obligation in the legal sense, but of ethical integrity. How we treat others when we matter to them says everything about who we are. This responsibility does not require perfection, but it does demand awareness. Being connected to someone means recognizing that your choices don't exist in a vacuum. When you speak carelessly, they feel it. When you pull away without explanation, they question their worth. When you act selfishly in the name of freedom, you might fracture someone who trusted you. Connection is not just about enjoying someone's company when it's convenient. It's about carrying the weight of being seen, known, and counted on. Once you become part of someone's emotional landscape, you owe them more than just temporary attention. You owe them clarity, honesty, and the decency to not disappear when things get complicated. People often talk about the right to leave, to move on, to choose themselves. And those rights are real, but the way you exercise those rights reveals your level of moral maturity. Just because you're allowed to walk away doesn't mean you're free from the consequences of how you do it. Walking away without accountability leaves behind confusion and damage. It sends a message that the other person's feelings were disposable. Moral responsibility means honoring the weight of your presence and exiting with the same care you once gave while staying. If you once promised emotional safety, you should not leave behind emotional wreckage. This responsibility becomes even more critical in relationships where vulnerability is high. When someone opens their heart, their fears, their past, or their dreams to you, they are giving you a kind of power. And with that power comes the obligation not to misuse it. You may not be able to love someone forever, but you can choose not to harm them. You can choose not to lie, to ghost, to manipulate, or to take more than you're willing to give. That is the ethical cost of intimacy. It's not about staying in situations that are no longer healthy. It's about leaving in a way that acknowledges the depth of what was shared. Moral responsibility in connection is about being human in the fullest sense, not just pursuing your own happiness, but recognizing the echo of your decisions in someone else's life. It's about remembering that hearts are not made of stone, and that presence once given leaves a mark that deserves to be respected even in departure. When you leave someone's life, you don't just walk away. You become a permanent chapter in their personal story. The exit, no matter how brief or dramatic, becomes part of the narrative they carry forward, a memory they will revisit at unexpected moments. Whether the relationship was long, term, or fleeting, whether it ended in conflict or silence. How you chose to leave will be remembered far longer than you might imagine. It shapes not only how they view you, but also how they come to view themselves, relationships, and their sense of worth. The moment you close the door becomes a snapshot that defines the emotional truth of the entire relationship. For the one left behind, that exit is not just an event. It's a turning point that reshapes the way they make sense of what happened between you. People construct meaning from their experiences to understand the world and their place in it. Every major relationship becomes a story, and the ending is what gives the story its tone. If you leave with compassion, clarity, and dignity, the story, though perhaps painful, retains a sense of value and maturity. But if you vanish, lash out, or abandon someone without explanation, the story becomes fragmented, confusing, and damaging. That kind of eggs, it doesn't just hurt. It leaves behind questions that often remain unanswered. The other person is forced to fill in the gaps, and in the absence of truth, they often blame themselves. The way you exit determines whether the relationship becomes a memory of growth or a source of deep emotional confusion. This is especially true when the connection was meaningful, when vulnerability and trust were involved. Your presence in their life wasn't casual, it carried weight. So your departure doesn't just fade into the background. It leaves an imprint, a narrative loop that can replay for years. Some people spend months or even years trying to make sense of why someone they cared for could leave the way they did. They tell the story again and again in their heads, trying to find the moment it all went wrong. And in telling that story, your exit becomes central to how they see relationships going forward. It becomes a silent influence on how much they open up to others, how much they trust, and how deeply they allow themselves to feel. Even if you think the relationship wasn't serious, even if it seemed like a short chapter in your life, you don't get to decide the weight it carried in theirs. That is the hidden truth of human connection. Its meaning is not always equal or reciprocal. Your actions, especially in the final moments, are not just about your freedom or your timing. They are about the story someone else will tell about being left. You might move on and forget the details, but the person on the other side will carry those details into their next experience, their next attempt at love, their next moment of doubt. The exit, as simple as it might seem to you, becomes a defining part of how they remember what it felt like to trust someone, and what it cost them when that trust was broken. There is a profound difference between leaving someone with closure and leaving them with damage. Closure is not about ensuring that the other person is unhurt. It's about respecting their humanity enough to offer clarity, honesty, and an ending that makes emotional sense. Damage, on the other hand, occurs when someone is left with confusion, unresolved feelings, and unanswered questions that become a breeding ground for self-doubt and emotional pain. The way a relationship ends doesn't just signal its finality. It defines the emotional residue that each person carries forward. A respectful goodbye offers the possibility of healing. A careless one often leaves a wound that festers in silence. When a person is given closure, they may still feel pain, but they're not left searching for meaning in the wreckage. They're not wondering if they were enough, or if they did something wrong, or why it felt like everything suddenly changed without explanation. Closure gives them something solid to stand on. It says, "This mattered, you mattered, and even though it's ending, you deserve honesty." It honors the time that was shared, the vulnerability that was offered, and the emotional investment that was made. It doesn't minimize the pain of parting, but it allows the pain to be processed in a healthy, grounded way. Damage occurs when someone is left abruptly or dishonestly, when the connection is severed without care or communication. It happens when someone chooses silence over truth, avoidance over responsibility. Damage makes the person left behind question their judgment, their worth, and their place in the relationship. They are forced to invent answers where none were given. They walk away not with resolution, but with emotional baggage that often leaks into future relationships. When you damage someone on your way out, you don't just hurt them in the present. You shape the way they show up for others in the future. The truth is, most people don't need you to stay. They just need to be seen, acknowledged, and respected as things come to a close. They need to know they weren't disposable, that the time they gave you wasn't one-sided, that the intimacy they offered wasn't something you walked away from without a second thought. Closure is not a grand gesture. It can be as simple as an honest conversation, an expression of gratitude, or an apology for the pain caused. But even in its simplicity, it is a powerful act of emotional maturity. On the other hand, inflicting damage is often rooted in avoidance. It feels easier to disappear than to explain, easier to deflect than to own the impact of your choices. But that ease comes at a cost, and it's usually paid by the person left behind. Damage lingers. It turns moments into questions and silence into fear, and it's often not remembered as an ending, but as an injury. The final act in any relationship carries an emotional weight that can tip the scale toward healing or harm. You may not control how the other person feels, but you do control whether it gives them the dignity to move forward or the pain that keeps them stuck. Leaving someone is never easy, but how you do it defines whether the relationship ends with respect or regret. Empathy before eggs, it is the conscious act of recognizing that your departure affects more than just your own freedom. It deeply impacts the person you're walking away from. It's the ability to pause even in discomfort and consider what the other person is feeling, what questions they might be left with, and how your actions might shape their emotional world long after you're gone. Empathy is not about staying in a place that no longer feels right, but about acknowledging that your presence had meaning, and your absence will, too. It's the difference between leaving someone in darkness and giving them a light to walk away with. When someone opens their life to you, when they invest emotionally, share vulnerabilities, and build expectations around your presence, they are giving you a part of themselves that isn't easily taken back. To leave without empathy is to disregard that gift. It is to treat their investment as a temporary convenience rather than a piece of shared humanity. People aren't machines you can turn off. They have hearts, memories, and attachments that don't simply vanish when someone decides to walk away. Empathy allows you to see that truth and act with care, even in your exit. Far too often, people choose to leave in ways that serve their own comfort while ignoring the emotional toll it takes on the other. They ghost, deflect, or withdraw gradually, leaving the other person confused and hurt. It might feel easier in the moment to avoid confrontation or to skip the hard conversation, but in doing so, they transfer the emotional burden onto the person left behind. That person is then left to process both the loss and the ambiguity of why it happened. Empathy before eggs. It is what prevents this kind of cruelty. It is taking the time to communicate, to be honest, to acknowledge the shared history, and to offer some form of emotional closure, even when it's uncomfortable. Empathy also means understanding timing, tone, and context. It means considering how fragile the other person might be at that moment and adjusting your delivery to avoid unnecessary harm. It means asking yourself not just, what do I need to say, but also, how can I say this in a way that honors what we had? Because even if the relationship couldn't last, the care you once shared doesn't have to be erased. You can leave with honesty and still be kind. You can speak your truth and still be gentle. You can create space for your needs without violating someone else's dignity. In a world that often praises self-interest and detachment, empathy is a radical act. It's the choice to remain human in the hardest moments, to see the other person not just as someone you're leaving, but as someone who will carry the memory of how you left. And when you lead with empathy, even a painful goodbye can be something both of you grow from, rather than something one of you has to heal from alone.